Well, thanks everyone for joining us this evening. We're really pleased to be able to offer this program tonight. My name's Eliza Canty-Jones, and I work at the Oregon Historical Society. We're very pleased to be able to offer this program in partnership with the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. The mission of the Oregon Historical Society is to preserve our state's history and make it accessible to everyone in ways that advance knowledge and inspire curiosity about all the peoples, places, and events that have shaped Oregon. And I'll just show a little slide here about some upcoming events that we recommend. One of our speakers this evening will also be speaking in another program on Monday that we'll be offering virtually. Excuse me while I remove the shoe from my puppy's mouth. I'm actually here in my home in Southeast Portland. And here in Portland, we're located on the traditional homelands of the Multnomah, Klamath, Clackamas, Tumwater, Walla bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. We always encourage folks to think about the fact that wherever you are in the United States, you're on indigenous land. And we encourage people to really learn the history of the indigenous peoples whose land you're on, and to learn about all of the history from time immemorial, but also the history of the past couple hundred years, which has involved so much violence and trauma and resilience. And so we're really pleased to have the opportunity to learn some of that this evening. I'm going to turn it over very quickly to David Harrelson to tell you a little bit about the bigger program that tonight's event is part of. David Harrelson is Cultural Resources Department Manager for the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. He's a Grand Ronde tribal member from the Bean Menard Singrata family. You're going to correct me on that, I hope, if I got it wrong. And he was raised by a mountaineer and grandparents who worked in education and healthcare. So, David?
Thank you, Eliza. It's great to be here and to be able to have the tribe co-host this event this evening. Since 2012, the tribe has hosted an annual History and Culture Summit. Many of you may know about that summit, and if you don't, we hope that you can join us in future years. It's often a two-day celebration of the history and culture of the tribe, where we have presenters from community as well as academics, partner agencies that we work with, and we have a really great time. There's good food, good company, an evening in the Plank House. So of course this year, like so many other events, we had to think, well, what are we going to do? And there were still a number of presentations and work that we've been doing that we really wanted to share with the public. And so we turned to virtual events. And when the opportunity arose to partner for one of those events with the Oregon Historical Society, we were excited, and we thought that this talk by Dr. Beckham on George Gibbs was the perfect fit. We do have one other event that's coming up in November, and you can find information about the History and Culture Summit, including year after year, at grandround.org/HC Summit. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the presentation.
Thanks very much. I look forward to the day when we can all be gathering in person again and sharing this together, but this is wonderful in the meantime. I'll tell folks a little bit about what tonight's program will be like. Very shortly, we're going to begin a presentation that Dr. Beckham has recorded. It's an audio-visual presentation that we'll be showing through the screen share. That'll last about a half an hour. And then all of us will pop back on again for a panelist discussion, reflecting on the presentation and asking each other questions and taking questions from you in our audience. So you'll be able to enter questions either through the chat or through the Q&A. If you need any kind of technical assistance, you can try to use the chat to reach Sara L at OHS in the meantime. We will recommend when the screen goes, I'm going to stop my screen share. Sarah's going to begin one to begin that audiovisual presentation. When that happens, we recommend that you collapse the boxes where you see our faces now. And there's a little tab at the top of those boxes. You'll see a bunch of squares, a couple rectangles, one rectangle, and then one small line. If you click on that small line, it should take away all of the images there and help keep us out of the way of the audiovisual presentation. I think that's it for the housekeeping, but we really look forward to sharing this program with all of you and engaging in the discussion afterwards. So thanks very much, and I will stop now so we can bring on the other part. And just give us a minute as this transfers over. You might see, I'll warn you that there might be a couple of boxes or square things in the way. So just give it a second for everything to catch up and it should be in good shape. And presenters, I'll just remind you, if you would turn off your camera and your microphone while we're watching this presentation, it will help keep us from distracting from that. So thanks everyone. See you in a half hour or so.
The Surprising Adventures of George Gibbs on the Oregon Frontier. George Gibbs, a name that is not familiar in the Pacific Northwest, was born in 1815 and died in 1873. With the stirrings of the discovery of gold in California in 1848, a restlessness swept through the United States, and among those restless people was a lawyer in New York City named George Gibbs. In 1849, he set out to travel the Oregon Trail across North America. Traveling with him were two friends, William Tappan, an artist and engraver, later the developer of St. Helens, Oregon, and an Indian agent, and George Templeton Strong, a Columbia University graduate and lawyer, and a keeper of a diary of 2,250 pages. These were Gibbs's trailmates. They crossed the Oregon Trail via the Missouri River and South Pass, and during that journey, Gibbs began making a series of sketches of notable landmarks along the way. Prairies, the plains, the geographical features, the geology, forts encountered like Fort Boise, then in ruins, the Hudson's Bay Company post on the Snake River, the descent of Ladd Canyon into the valley of the Grand Ronde, and his arrival at Wascopum Mission at the Dalles, Oregon in the fall of 1849. Gibbs's destination was Fort Vancouver. On the left, a series of military buildings on a high plateau overlooking the old Hudson's Bay Company fort on the banks of the Columbia River. Gibbs kept a diary during his transit of the Oregon Trail. It was subsequently published along with those of military men in the book The March of the Mounted Rifleman. Gibbs kept on going west and settled in 1850 in Astoria, where he became the Assistant Collector of Customs. A historic photo of the old customs house is the small office where he worked. Astoria in 1850 was little more than a fur trading post at the mouth of the Columbia River. Gibbs, however, became one of Clatsop County's first commissioners. He became a member of the Oregon Bar and a practicing lawyer, and he was elected to the school board in Astoria. The community was surrounded by dense forest. It was just a few buildings along the margin of the river with a wharf and warehouse or two on the south bank. It was there in 1850 that Gibbs began his field work. Here we see his notes. A census of the Chinook tribe of Indians living below the mouth of the Willamette River. Gibbs had a great fascination with Native Americans. He wrote in one of his notebooks, "These Chinooks, with the exception of one family, live either on the north side of the river or on the two small islands, Woody Island and Tennis-Illiquis, near Bernie's. They subsist altogether upon fish and roots, generally a few potatoes. Individuals among them occasionally procure game, but only one hunter, properly so called, is found among the tribe." In addition to field notes and census records and vocabularies, Gibbs also was an accomplished artist. Here is a pencil sketch that he did of the prow of a Chinook canoe that was pulled up on the shore of the Columbia River. He was interested in how the native people had adapted to Euro-American culture, such as using a sail in their dugouts in order to take advantage of wind and moving against the tide. His sketch at Oak Point on the lower Columbia, 1851. In 1851, Gibbs journeyed up the Columbia to its confluence with the Willamette to a small frontier community called Milwaukee. He sketched there Lot Whitcomb's shipyard and sawmill, traveled on to the falls of the Willamette, where he sketched the Indian fishery at the Great Falls of the river. He made an incomplete sketch of Oregon City with its several buildings, here more fully finished by John McStanley, an artist who also visited Oregon City in the late 1840s. Gibbs's destination was Champoeg, where he was to serve as the secretary for the Willamette Valley Treaty Commission in April and May of 1851, a commission appointed by the President of the United States to secure land cessions with the tribes in the Willamette Valley. As secretary and cartographer for the commission, Gibbs and Edmund Starling developed a large map of considerable detail about the valley. It showed the potential reservations, it identified the various tribes and bands, it also identified rivers, trails, and names of early settlers and their settlements. This manuscript map, nearly 7 feet long, survives in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Gibbs's map provided the first overview in some detail of the Willamette Valley and its primary features. He included the South Fork of the Yam Hill, where he noted cattle trail to the Oregon coast. So as early as 1851, settlers in the Willamette Valley were driving their livestock via the Salmon River over the Coast Range of mountains to pasture along the Salmon and Nestucca rivers on the central coast of Oregon. Gibbs continued making notes on Native Americans. He was very interested in large rocks or stones that may have spirit power or tamanoas, and he wrote about that as well in his interviews with Native informants. He made a sketch of Alquema, the Santiam chief, who was one of the spokesmen at the Treaty Council of 1851, and also of Slocum, the chief of the Tlowi-Wallace, who lived at the falls of the Willamette. In the fall of 1851, Gibbs boarded the Columbia, a side-wheeler with sails, to sail to California. The reason for his visit was that he had 2 cousins who were operating a store in San Francisco, and he wanted to visit with them, but also his brother Francis was in San Francisco on his way to China, and his brother Alfred had been stationed at Sonoma Barracks with the U.S. Army. The barracks had been built in the 1830s by General Manuel Vallejo. They had been seized by the Americans in 1846, and the base became a U.S. Army post in 1846 and occupied by the Army through 1852. Gibbs's brother Alfred, a graduate of West Point, was at Sonoma Barracks. While Gibbs was there, he made a sketch of the fort, and he also ran into Reddick McKee, who was the newly appointed commissioner of the California Treaty Commission of 1851, and Gibbs secured his employment by McKee to serve as secretary for the Treaty Commission. McKee began a long journey with the U.S. Army detachment from Sonoma Barracks to travel through the Russian River Valley, the Eel River Valley, the northwestern coast of California, and far up into the Klamath River country of northwestern California in the fall of 1851. Gibbs served as secretary and as cartographer for the McKee Treaty Commission, along with John McKee, another recorder of the events. They visited Clear Lake to round up Pomo Indians for a treaty council, and Gibbs began sketching the towering redwood trees that he found growing in northwestern California. He also continued his interest in Native Americans, sketching a young girl, a woman with a baby and a cradle board on her back, and collecting artifacts that he packaged in boxes and shipped to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. He collected horn spoons, acorn winnowing trays, food baskets, storage baskets, magnificent examples of the handiwork of the Native American craftspeople of northwestern California. Also in the collections that he sent to Washington, D.C. were fibers, bows and arrows, and other commonly used tools. During his travels, Gibbs continued keeping a diary, and in February of 1852, at Benicia, California, he completed his journal and turned it over to Reddick McKee. He also compiled a magnificent map of northwestern part of California, a detailed map showing the route of travels with streams and mountains, mining camps, and tribal distribution, a major contribution to the geographical understanding of the northwestern part of the state. Having visited the gold fields, Gibbs decided that he would sojourn for a while on the Klamath River, and he became a gold miner on the Klamath. But the extraction of gold required tremendous labor. Consequently, he employed Hupa and Karuk Indians from the Klamath River Canyon to help work the diggings. The men built flumes to divert the river and empty out the stream bed in order to get to the placer gold deposits, and Gibbs paid the Indians with dentalium shells, long, white, highly prized wealth items that came from the west coast of Vancouver Island. But Gibbs's dentalium shells were counterfeit. They had been made of porcelain in Shanghai, where his brother Frank operated a family trading store. Thus, Gibbs introduced a new trade item, a porcelain shell counterfeit for dentalium, into the currency of the Indian trade in northwestern California. In 1853, with a change in administration in Washington, D.C., Gibbs was appointed by Millard Fillmore, Whig president, to the post of Collector of Customs in Astoria. Thus he returned to the mouth of the Columbia River. Here he continued his Native American studies among the Chinookan and Clatsop peoples who lived on both sides of the mouth of the river. And as was the case in California, he continued making ethnographic collections, such as this handsome wooden bowl, or clubs and spoons and other devices, the stunning artwork of the peoples of the Lower Columbia that he sent to Washington, D.C. He also began writing for Henry Schoolcraft, who was editing a 6-volume account of the Indian tribes of the United States. And from his post at the mouth of the Columbia River, Gibbs wrote a whole series of articles for this multi-volume work. Observations on some Indian dialects of Northwest California, vocabularies of Indian languages of Northwest California, his Journal of the McKee Expedition, and an essay on no antiquities in Oregon, meaning no major archaeological sites that he had discerned. He also continued work on what would eventually become a dictionary of the Chinook jargon, subsequently published in New York City during the Civil War. Gibbs had a great curiosity about where he was. In a letter to his mother in 1853, he noted, "I took a run the other day up Lewis and Clark's River, as it is called, to the place of the winter encampment, which long as I've been here I've never visited before. The site of their log hut is still visible, the foundation logs rotting where they lay. The old trail to the coast is just visible, being much overgrown with brush. Indians are still living who knew them." And who were the thems? Well, that was Lewis and Clark. Gibbs had visited the site of Fort Clatsop, the Lewis and Clark winter encampment. In 1853, Gibbs left his employment as collector of customs to become involved in the Pacific Railroad surveys under the direction of Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. Gibbs went directly to work for George McClellan for the survey in Washington Territory. McClellan employed Gibbs as geologist. Gibbs first mounted a reconnaissance of Willapa Bay, a tidal estuary and series of rivers lying north of the mouth of the Columbia River. And then he made a long journey up the eastern flank of the Cascade Mountains to Canada and then down the main stem of the Columbia River. The assignment was to try to find suitable passes through the Cascade Mountains for the Transcontinental Railroad. During these travels in 1853, Gibbs made extensive notes on the properties of the Hudson's Bay Company, including Fort Vancouver and Fort Okanagan. His field notebooks were filled with information, not only on geology, but on the natural history of the areas that he visited. Fish, birds, mollusks, all living things seemed to fall within his arena of interest. He contributed to the volume on reptiles and mammals and wrote a series of reports on the geology of the country east of the Cascades, his reconnaissance of the country on Shoalwater Bay or Willapa Bay in Puget Sound, and his report on the Indian tribes to Captain McClellan in 1855. the first overview, history, or account of the tribes of Washington Territory. He also did special reports on the geology of the central portion of the territory and a report on the mammals, co-authored with Dr. George Suckley. Gibbs then in 1854 relocated to Puget Sound. He became a surveyor for the topographical engineers, and he worked on 3 major military roads. One from Puget Sound to Fort Walla Walla, another from Astoria to Salem, Oregon, and a third one from Fort Vancouver north to Fort Steilacoom, the route today of Interstate 5 in western Washington. In these assignments, he worked directly with professional staff members of the U.S. topographical engineers. His particular friend was George Derby, who was an author and traveler and a great jokester, and he and Gibbs had many good times together. In 1854, December, Gibbs was secured in new employment by Isaac Ingalls Stevens, the new governor of Washington Territory. He hired Gibbs as surveyor and acting secretary of the Western Washington Treaty Commission. Gibbs drafted the template treaty, the treaty that was used for 10 ratified agreements that Stevens would eventually secure in Washington Territory. And in September 1854, he made a very shrewd observation. Gibbs wrote, "To throw the fishing tribes of the coast back upon the interior, even were the measure possible, would destroy them. Nor is there any suitable region east of the Cascades where all the tribes now living there could be concentrated and find food. They must therefore remain as they are." Gibbs insisted that the tribes should have reserved right guarantees in their treaties. In like manner, the use of their customary fisheries and free pasturage for their stock on unenclosed lands should be secured. And he wrote, "It never could have been the intention of Congress that the Indians could be excluded from their ancient fisheries." So the 20th century fish wars that were fought over the words in the treaties in Washington Territory were those that were penned in 1854 by George Gibbs, the secretary to the Treaty Commission. Gibbs traveled extensively with Governor Stevens to the various treaty councils on Puget Sound. He kept detailed minutes of the sessions as well as a personal diary. He noted the gatherings of the various tribes. He interviewed the tribal leaders. He wrote down population numbers, and he filled out vocabulary lists, usually 150 words for each vocabulary based upon or founded upon a list developed by Albert Gallatin. Another associate involved in these travels was James G. Swan of Port Townsend and Neah Bay. Swan was also a collector and a man of ambition and erudition, and was an associate of Gibbs. Gibbs participated in the councils at Medicine Creek, Point Elliott, Point No Point, Neah Bay, and Chehalis River. The first 4 councils were ratified treaty agreements. The 5th council was not ratified. Gibbs settled at the southern end of Puget Sound and secured a donation land claim near Steilacoom, not too far from Olympia. This was a good location for him. He could ride his horse into town at Steilacoom, or he could go to the capital in Olympia. In 1854-55, while Governor Stevens was in the east in Washington, D.C., he named Gibbs acting governor of Washington Territory. Gibbs had an office in the new territorial capital in Olympia. During the Indian War of 1855-56, Gibbs served as Brigadier General of the Territorial Militia. He established his headquarters at Fort Vancouver on the Columbia River. In 1856, Gibbs wrote a personal letter to his friend, scientist John LeConte, and said, "I want to get up a general work on the ethnology of this whole coast. Let the Smithsonian through the Indian Department get me appointed a full agent, say nominally for this district or California, but not subject to orders from the superintendent or assigned to duty under him, but reporting only to Washington and giving me my travel expenses besides the salary. I don't want to make money, but a reputation out of it." Gibbs thought $1,500 would do well, and it would enable him to write an ethnographic overview from the Bering Straits to the Isthmus of Panama. He did not get that appointment, but in 1857, he was appointed ethnologist and geologist for the Northwest Boundary Survey to open and survey the 49th parallel between the United States and Canada. During that survey, Gibbs had the opportunity to visit the tribes of Western British Columbia. He executed handsome watercolors, and he worked with Dr. C.B.R. Kennerly, the photographer for the expedition, on taking some of the first photographs in the rural parts or wild parts of Washington Territory. This is Kennerly's photo of the Boundary Survey's winter camp, Camp Simiamu, near Point Roberts on the 49th parallel, 1857. Eventually, the crew cut a swath through the forest and over the Cascade Mountains through very rugged terrain. It took dozens of axemen as well as the surveyors to lay out the route and stack the stone monuments for the 49th parallel. Eventually, they came out at Lake Osoyoos in the upper Okanagan country on the east side of the Cascade Mountains, and then pressed on toward the Rockies. This was a multi-year survey, taking nearly 3.5 years in the field, giving Gibbs ample opportunity to work as a geologist and also ethnographer and linguist. The beautiful watercolors were executed by James Madison Alden, another associate of Gibbs who was on government service in the American West in the 1850s. With the outbreak of the Civil War, Gibbs returned to the East for the first time since coming west in 1849. He became scholar in residence and took an apartment in one of the towers at the Smithsonian, and he lived there for a decade through the Civil War and following. He had multiple tasks. He was charged with organizing the Smithsonian's Native American vocabularies and notes. He served the U.S. Secretary for the Hudson's Bay Company Claims Commission, collecting data on the claims of the company against the United States. He wrote reports for a projected multi-volume publication on the Northwest Boundary Survey, and he worked with John G. Shea on a series of dictionaries for the Library of American Indian Linguistics. And the publications came steadily. A Dictionary of the Yakima Language, 1862, Tlalam and Lummi, 1863, Chinook Language, 1863, Dictionary of the Nisqually, 1877, and so on. Gibbs also wrote technical bulletins for the Smithsonian on archaeology, philology, on specific tribes, and on objects of scientific investigation in Russian America. He was much interested in Alaska, and he helped draft Senator Charles Sumner's speech endorsing the American acquisition of Alaska. Gibbs also wrote for the American Journal of Science and Arts, for the American Naturalist, for the American Philological Association, for North American Ethnology, American Geographical Society, New York Historical Society. Several places published his accounts. He also edited in 14 massive volumes the evidence of the United States in the matter of the claim of the Hudson's Bay Company that led to a final financial settlement between the United States and the company for its assets that it lost in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. So who was this man? Where did he come from? His grandfather, George Gibbs, who died in 1803, was commonly called the Merchant Prince of Newport, Rhode Island. He was the wealthiest American in the late 18th century. The Gibbs family home was a handsome mansion that yet stands facing the old stone mill in the center of Newport, Rhode Island. On his grandfather's death in 1803, Gibbs's grandmother, Mary Channing Gibbs, bought the handsome Harrelson Gray Otis mansion on Beacon Hill in Boston. And it was to this mansion that Gibbs would go when he was a college student in nearby Cambridge. His father, George Gibbs, who died in 1833, was known as Colonel George Gibbs, and Gibbs's childhood home was in Queens, or present-day Astoria, New York, a handsome country mansion on a large estate of several hundreds of acres. When his father, friend Gilbert Stewart, started painting portraits, Colonel Gibbs commissioned one of himself and of his wife Laura, and then he said, "Why don't you do a picture for me of George Washington, and John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, and Monroe?" So the first 5 presidents of the United States were painted in likenesses by Gilbert Stuart, and these images hung in the childhood home of George Gibbs at Sunswick Farms in Long Island, New York. His other grandfather was Oliver Wolcott Jr. Wolcott Jr.'s father was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and Oliver Wolcott Jr. was Secretary of the Treasury for George Washington and John Adams, succeeding Alexander Hamilton. So George Gibbs had rather significant grandparents and parents. As a boy, he attended a private school in Northampton, Massachusetts. He was enrolled at Round Hill School for 9 years. He went to Harvard, where he studied at the Dane Law College from 1834 to 1838. His roommate, Charles Sumner, later became the famed senator from Massachusetts during the U.S. Civil War. From 1838 to 1840, Gibbs spent 2 years making a grand tour of Europe, traveling with a college classmate, visiting cities, studying modern languages, and sketching. He entered law practice in New York City in 1840 and continued as a member of the New York Bar for 9 years. But his real interest was serving as librarian of the New York Historical Society, where from 1842 to 1849, he helped organize the first card catalog for the New York Historical Society. He published significantly. His first book, The Judicial Chronicle, was published while he was a Harvard Law student, and in 1845, in nearly 1,200 pages in 2 volumes, he brought out the Memoirs of the Administrations of Washington and Adams, a history of the first 2 presidential administrations of the United States of America in the late 18th century. George Gibbs came from a large family. He was the eldest of several brothers and sisters. His sisters were Elizabeth and Laura, and his brothers were Oliver, Alfred, and Francis. Oliver became Dr. Oliver Wolcott Gibbs, a distinguished scientist at Harvard University, living till 1908. Alfred served in the Civil War and died in 1868. Francis ran the family trading house in Shanghai and lived mostly in China. Among the influences in Gibbs's early life was Benjamin Silliman, founder of the Sheffield Scientific School at Yale and editor of the American Journal of Arts and Sciences. He eventually convinced the Gibbs family to give Colonel Gibbs's private mineral collection to Yale University, 22,000 specimens of minerals, one of the largest such collections in the world. Another childhood friend was James Fenimore Cooper. James Fenimore Cooper, American novelist, wrote the novel Precaution in 1820, The Spy in 1821, The Pioneers in 1823, and The Last of the Mohicans in 1826. He was living at the Gibbs estate, Sunswick Farms, when he wrote The Last of the Mohicans. So imagine George Gibbs, then a boy of 11 or 12, interacting with James Fenimore Cooper. Why, who wouldn't want to be like one of those frontier heroes dealing with Native Americans in Cooper's exciting novels? So there were multiple influences. Another one was John Lloyd Stevens, a graduate of Columbia, a traveler in Europe and Egypt, who went to Central America in 1839, then to Mesoamerica in 1841, and made extensive publications on his incidents of travel in the Yucatan. The beautiful plates that were developed by Frederick Catherwood for Stevens's publications were exhibited under Gibbs's direction at the New York Historical Society in 1846-1847. Probably another influence on helping drive Gibbs's interest in Native Americans. So here were his labors: a lawyer in New York, Oregon, and Washington, librarian, historian and author, county commissioner, gold miner, collector of customs, and a member of the treaty commissions in the Willamette Valley, northwestern California, and western Washington. A geologist with the Pacific Railroad surveys, surveyor and cartographer on military road surveys, brigadier general, acting governor, ethnologist and geologist, Smithsonian scholar in residence, American Indian linguistics scholar, secretary of the Hudson's Bay Company Claims Commission, artist, diarist, and letter writer. Gibbs kept extensive diaries for almost all of his 11 years in the American West. Gibbs eventually married his first cousin, Mary King Gibbs, in 1871. He died in 1873. His wife died in 1876. They settled on marriage on Wall Street in New Haven, Connecticut. And today, the mighty Beinecke Library, one of the nation's finest rare book collections, stands on the site of where Gibbs and his wife lived and died in New Haven. Gibbs, in his old age, was a philanthropist. In 1869, he offered the Redwood Library and Athenaeum in Newport $500 in books and $10,000 of a challenge grant to build a new addition to that venerable research institution founded in 1727. On his death in 1873, Gibbs was buried in the cemetery at the little country chapel that his Aunt Sara had built on an island near Newport, Rhode Island. And there is his grave covered with lichen in a country cemetery in a place where his ancestors had lived for nearly 200 years before his birth. For those who would like to read further, there is a biographical sketch of George Gibbs published in the volume Eminent Historians, an account by Professor Beckham. And there's also a biographical sketch of his father, the mineralogist and wealthy patron of science, Colonel George Gibbs, in the book Benjamin Silliman and His Circle. Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much. And I should note, I was so excited to get to the presentation that I neglected to introduce the person who created it. So let me begin there. We have to thank for that excellent work, Dr. Stephen Dow Beckham, who is the Pamplin Professor of History Emeritus at Lewis and Clark College. He taught college students for 42 years. His courses, research, and writing have addressed Native Americans, the American West, and American environmental history. And he has been working on all of the research that you saw this evening for 6 decades, I believe. Is that right, Dr. Beckham?
That's correct. I ran on to Gibbs when I was 19 years old and started to work on a master's thesis. And during the course of that work on a study of the Rogue River Indian Wars in Northern California and Southern Oregon, I kept running onto the name Gibbs. And eventually he became such a fascination that he was the victim of my doctoral dissertation.
Excellent. Well, where are the benefits? So we also have with us for our panel discussion this evening, Dr. Sara L. Gonzalez, who is an associate professor of anthropology and an adjunct professor of American Indian Studies at the University of Washington, where she is also a curator of archaeology at the Burke Museum of Natural History. And also Dr. Shannon Tushingham. These are all doctors, so we admire you all very much. Dr. Tushingham is an assistant professor of anthropology at Washington State University, where she is also the director of the Museum of Anthropology and Northwest Archaeological Research Laboratory. I could take all of our time telling you much more of the biographies of these incredibly smart and accomplished people, but they told me they would rather talk about George Gibbs and answer questions. So we will get right to it. And what we want to ask first is just to have everyone speak. What about Gibbs is so important for folks to understand? And I'm going to give you an order to go in. So I'd like to start with Dr. Gonzalez, and then Dr. Tushingham, Dr. Harrelson, and Dr. Beckham, if you want to chime in on any other parts after that. Will that work for everyone? All right. Thanks so much.
So what's important about Gibbs for me, I'm an archaeologist, and you wouldn't imagine that there's many archaeologists reading history, and especially some of these early travelogues and journals. And yet, for me as somebody who works with tribal nations in California, Oregon, and Washington, including through the community-based project that I've developed with the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde's Historic Preservation Office, reading the accounts of Gibbs provide a really fundamental window into these kind of settler colonial engagements at a really critical moment in time for tribal nations and communities throughout the Western Pacific here. So Gibbs is one of these really interesting figures. And before Dr. Beckham did this, I really didn't know very much about him. So thank you, Steve, for putting together this biography and kind of a primer to understand somebody who was really at a lot of these different critical junctures that we reference today in thinking about tribal relations with, the US settler states and what their histories have looked like, especially at that critical moment of being removed from reservation to present day. So for me, it's really going back to it and getting a eyewitness account of what some of those negotiations looked like at a moment in time that we don't have a lot of information about.
Yeah, I have to agree with Sara. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, I agree with Sara on the value of these early accounts. And I think Gibbs, I'm just so fascinated at all the places he was and all the people he knew. He really was, it was a who's who of that time for sure. I think for me, this is such a critical time to understand, and there's so much that is often glossed over in anthropology and in archaeological narratives in the traditional sense. And so any kind of window that we have into this period of time is so important. I think, the various, I'm just kind of blown away by all the vocabularies and the maps and the drawings and all these little bits and pieces and details. I feel for you, Stephen, just sort of dedicating your career to investigating all these little details. And, if we look at a map of one of those places, that can help us reconstruct settlement patterns in the past and things that we just would love to see. So I think for me, that's a big part of understanding this, this sort of bridging period almost between contact. It was a very tumultuous time. And I think we'll get into this a little bit later, but particularly the gold rush in this part of the world was a very tragic and difficult time for people. So much to talk about.
Thank you, Eliza. You might be giving out honorary degrees. I have to say that I do not have a PhD. So to honesty, to all the people that did that hard work, I'm not in that crowd. I do a lot of work, applied work in anthropology, archaeology, history. And what I found really particularly valuable about Gibbs' work is that there aren't many opportunities for tribal voices to come forward from that time. They're not necessarily written down. And when there are perspectives that are shared by early settlers, they seem to come with a lot of bias and judgment. And what I've really found spectacular about Gibbs' material is that he often, took opportunities to document and provide written voice from tribal people, so we can look back and hear the words from minutes that are recorded from those commission meetings. You don't get the same work that later salvage ethnographers sort of have this trope of the vanishing race and very fraught and challenging things to sift through to create understanding and actually hear native voice. But with George Gibbs' work, which is, even if it was a quarter of what it is, it would be spectacular, but it's voluminous and massive, and it doesn't come with all that bias. And I think it helps us, as best as we're going to get, hear some actual voices of Native people. And in the day and age where doing Indigenous studies work, decolonization work is so important, to me, it's important that we don't overlook these key white men of the past. And I say that because in the case of Gibbs, it helps tell that history that wouldn't otherwise be available. And so if we just forge forward with this idea of trying to not worry or care about that, we're going to miss out on a lot of opportunities that strengthen and create awareness about our own community.
I have a comment. It's interesting that the Gibbs material was scattered all over the United States. When he died in 1873 with no children, his heirs, his nephews and nieces, divided up his papers. So when I started the research on Gibbs, I went to Eugene, Oregon, to Berkeley, California, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Newport, Rhode Island, Cambridge, Massachusetts, New York City, Washington, D.C. His materials were all over the place, and it took a long time to put them together. But they keep on giving. This year, I was doing a project for the Karuk tribe of Northwestern California. Among the materials in one of Gibbs's manuscript notebooks were the place names mapped accurately, consecutively along the lower Klamath River with the more than 40 place names of villages of the Yurok, Hupa, and Karuk tribes. There was that information just lurking there, waiting there, untapped by anyone. And suddenly it had a use in 2020. And that is the wonder of being, I think, a researcher who happens on to a fellow like George Gibbs.
That's fascinating. It's a great lead into my next question, but I can't stop thinking about that 7-foot map and how much I want to see that. I'm interested to have panelists speak about how does Gibbs's story relate to your own work and how does it relate to tribal collaborations? So Dr. Beckham, thank you for giving us one example already. And I'll let you all decide your own order this time. So whoever wants to speak first about that. But somebody has to volunteer.
I guess I can, oh, go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to vote for David because I think it's really important in this context to think about from a tribal perspective directly, what can we recover from using these kinds of documents and, you know, people writing in the 1850s or not people writing in 2020. There, like David had said, there's a lot of biases there. So I think, David, if you want to chat about how the tribe sees something like this as being valuable, that might be good to kind of contextualize then.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. You know, probably one of the most material examples of George Gibbs, and you saw the image of the Oak Point canoe, right? It was in that presentation that had a sail on it. And, you know, for a long time, really, people haven't been making canoes. And so in the last 15 years, we've started to make canoes. And some of the first canoes that were built, the lines off of the Scarborough canoe, which is in the Oregon Historical Society collection and is in exhibit as a part of my Oregon. And that influenced those. But there were many different styles of canoes, even Chinookan canoes. And one of those is documented in Gibbs' drawing. And it's really not known in any other context. It's a much smaller canoe. Its lines are a little bit different in shape. And so, you know, an example of that is we work to bring those canoes, like wake them up again, right? And do this revitalization work in our communities. We take inspiration from this image that's left. And today there is a canoe that follows those lines in the Chichalu exhibit hall. Right. And so that is like a very real and tangible way where, you know, history like can be living. But then also imagine how he recorded the minutes. Not only did he draw Chief Alquema, but he actually recorded the minutes and gave voice to Chief Alquema saying, you know, we will not move from this land. These are the reasons why. And today we have tribal members in our own community who know that they're descendant of that person. And they can read the words of their ancestors as a part of a treaty curing. And how those words are written ring true, like they come through in a very authentic way. And that is just invaluable to identity and understanding of place, and understood that like their ancestors fought for something other than what happened. And I think that in a time where we're seeking to like heal historic trauma and the challenges that we faced, like it's important. It helps. It's empowering.
I want to follow up on that because something that David pointed out right there is really important. And it's like, how do we bring this knowledge back into community? And as an archaeologist who partners with tribes, it's a really large focus of my work. I'm specifically thinking here about one of my graduate students, Yole Gondoli, who's been working with Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde to bring back portable rock belongings back into communities so that the collections, these collections, that these gentlemanly scholars like Gibbs and other folks working here in the Pacific Northwest, and then later, trained archaeologists and anthropologists, so that all of the information that they've created can be brought back into community and brought back in relation to tribal members today. I think that's a really critical aspect of the work that many of us are doing in archaeology and in anthropology, especially if they're involving tribal collaborations. Because as Dr. Beckham noted, Gibbs's papers, the collections that he made, various aspects of his work is scattered across different repositories. And so oftentimes you kind of have to do an archaeology of the collections and the repositories in order to bring back all of this information together in a way that makes sense for people and so that people can fully benefit from it. So I think that's a really large aspect of the collaborations, not just only in my work and the work of graduate students that I supervise at the University of Washington, but also across kind of this larger spectrum of tribal collaborations with museums, archaeologists, and anthropologists.
I just wanted to mention too that following along with this conversation is this time period that Gibbs, particularly when he was in Northwestern California and on the coast of Washington and Oregon, is a period of time that I've been trying to grapple with, and the Native American communities that I work with. This is a very difficult time, obviously, for them. It's a time of, a lot of the people that Gibbs was encountering were genocide survivors. They were people that had been, lived through terrible massacres. And some of the work that I've done with the Tolowa community on the Smith River in Northern California, these accounts can really fill in the blanks. We have oral histories, and then we have the standard archaeological texts and the anthropological texts. And there's this tradition in anthropology, or there was a tradition in anthropology, to really ignore, act as if those historical accounts didn't happen, to try and reconstruct some sort of pure way, of life that occurred, and just ignoring everything that people were going through. And so as I was listening to this, Dr. Beckham's presentation about how he was there, and he was a gold miner, and he was working side by side with some, was it Hupa and Karuk people on the Klamath River, that really piqued my interest, because a lot of the conversations that I have with indigenous communities is about survivance. Like how did people actively get through these periods of time, and what are the threads that connect them from the past to the modern day? And so on the Smith River, we excavated some near a house, a contact period house that dates to this time period. And we found, it was a traditional Native American house, and we found a miner's pick. And that was a real enigma. What is a miner's pick doing here? Because it's always been, mining is over here and Native Americans are over here. And later on, we found some historical documents were uncovered that showed that there were Tolowa people that owned mining claims at that time. And that was a complete revelation. So there's, these little things, when you, these little details that you can uncover are just so important to these histories. They really fill in the gaps. And I think, like Dr. Beckham was saying, we're still discovering these things. We're still sort of, looking at things with a new eye, and hopefully becoming more sensitive to, or more attuned to what was happening at that period of time.
Over the years, I've found it interesting how many different people make discoveries in Gibbs's material. I had a call some 25 years ago from a legendary mountain climber named Fred Beckey out of Seattle. Fred was working some 40 years on a magnificent book called A Range of Glaciers, A History of the North Cascades. And Fred came down to Portland to spend several hours with me to talk about Gibbs's 3.5 years sojourning in the Northern Cascades. It turns out that Gibbs was probably the first diarist to chronicle camping, hiking, and exploring that area. He also had a lot of curiosity. He made a multi-day canoe trip up the Skagit River against the current in order to ascertain the course of the river and its relationship with Mount Baker, as well as to map the Native American villages along its course. Or another aspect of Gibbs was his fascinating relationship with his college roommate, Charles Sumner. Gibbs's experience in the Pacific Northwest helped him fortify the arguments that went into Sumner's multi-hour speech justifying the American purchase of Alaska. Gibbs basically wrote the outline and Sumner delivered the message, and Seward got his folly, the acquisition of Alaska for the United States. So there are all sorts of dimensions to Gibbs, more than 100 Indian vocabularies, ethnographic notes, material culture collections, marvelous maps, sketches, or as David has mentioned, verbatim transcripts of some of the commentaries made by Native people in the treaty councils of the 1850s.
We have a couple of questions about those collections, and one has to do with whether the words of those ancestors, like you were just talking about, Dr. Beckham, are those that were collected by Gibbs, are those coordinated and available anywhere for folks to read? Or are they in all of these disparate places? I'll ask that one first.
The minutes for the Willamette Valley Treaty Commission are available in the book, The Calipulians, edited by Harold Mackey. So that is a volume that's available in many libraries. And I find those minutes of those unratified treaties absolutely fascinating because they're one of the most explicit examples of the Native American perspective on what was happening to them as they confronted these treaty commissioners from the United States. So yes, some of these things are available. A number of the vocabulary lists are online from the Smithsonian's National Anthropological Archives.
Thank you. And there's a question specifically directed at you, David. So we'll ask you to speak on this first, and then others can weigh in, certainly as they see. But it has to do with how tribes regard the role that early ethnographers like Gibbs and Swan played in the practice of collecting belongings from Indigenous people and then sending them back to the Smithsonian to be put on exhibit. Is this considered appropriation now? Is there an effort or movement to bring those items home? How do you look at that from that tribal perspective?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. I think one of the caveats is that, it's really important that, I can really only speak for my community, and that's because of the position that I have, and I can't speak for all communities, and many communities have different perspectives. A little bit about that for us. It is common, I think, with all that said, it's common among tribes to see it as, takings under duress. And we have examples in collections, where a taking is like very tragic and clear, like it has a bullet hole mark and blood stains on, buckskin. That exists in collections that have not been returned to tribes. And then we have other examples like journals that say, and that isn't a George Gibbs, that's an example from the Smithsonian of a different tribe. But then we have examples where it's really documented well that, the collector paid someone for it. And the general take is we've confronted that as a community with like the collections from the British Museum that we actually successfully had a loan of items from the Summers collection back to the Grand Round tribe. Our general take is that it is a taking. It was a taking under duress because these people didn't have much. And you can see that in some of the dialogue that goes back and forth, that they don't really want to give these things up. But then again, somebody's offering them money and they have to face some of those hard realities. And so it generally is a take that, we want to see those things return home. I think that one of the pieces that is a misunderstanding is that it comes from somehow our own desire to collect, which that's not what it's about. To us, it's about living culture and objects. And so we seek to bring those things home and have them be a part of our community because they're actually part of a living tradition. So when we brought back the ash bark tray from the British Museum, we then learned and reconstructed those and had classes. And we actually used them to parch seeds, right? And engage in our traditional foods and practices. And so we learned the construction of baskets. We learned from the objects that come back. I want to link to what Sara was talking about in the work of her grad student, Yoli. There's some really powerful analysis tools that are available for collections today. And Yoli's on the leading edge of some of that work, which is actually looking at groundstone and looking at it in different rays of light and actually revealing trace pigment and other designs that are on those objects. So things that wouldn't have even been visible to the collector hundreds of years ago, suddenly today can come back. And those things can be immensely meaningful in our community because it can reintroduce whole design themes that people can embrace and incorporate into a living culture. That's the reasons why we need to engage with collections and in many cases bring them home, even if it's only for a loan, so that our people can engage and interact with collections.
I'm just going to ask you all to speak a little bit more in that vein about how materials like the ones that Gibbs created and collected, how can those materials be helpful or problematic in understanding Indigenous history and culture? Maybe that's more of an and instead of an or, but if you all would speak some more broadly about that or directly connected to Gibbs, that would be great.
I can speak directly to it. It's why my life went from classroom to courtroom. I have repeatedly drawn upon George Gibbs's materials and those of his contemporaries as an expert witness in court in matters relating to reservation boundaries, reserved treaty rights, matters that are interpreted through the canons of Indian law as the tribes would have understood them at the time that the treaty was negotiated. And one of the ways that that understanding is expanded upon or validated are in those personal diaries and in the correspondence of people like Gibbs. So prior to the Treaty of Medicine Creek, Gibbs had already gone on record in publication that the tribes needed reserved lands and reserved subsistence rights within their homelands, and that they should not be removed beyond the mountains. So when that concept is articulated by a Euro-American, and then he is participating in that treaty council, and the tribes agree to that agreement and sign that treaty, it becomes compelling for the court today to interpret it as reserved rights belonging to the tribal people.
I mean, anytime you're working with the writings from people at different periods of time, there's a certain amount, I think David's talked about this and Dr. Beckham has talked about this, a certain amount of sifting through in order to determine what the biases are of the individual who created those accounts. And in Gibbs's case, I haven't had to work with his documents directly, but I have worked with other kind of early ethnohistorians or scholars, whatever you want to call them. And in many cases, some of those things are very overt. You know, I'm thinking Gibbs had also been in the area of the different Pomo communities in Northern California. And I've worked with Kashaya Band and Pomo Indians, and most of the people who are writing about them talked about them in overtly kind of derogatory manner. talking about Native peoples as being pristine savages and, not even being fully human or not having the same kinds of genders as we do today. And in a way to play up how different or how other they were from us being kind of white settler society. In Gibbs's case, I think there's a little bit less that happens there, but something that stood out to me in the PowerPoint was how Gibbs himself was kind of taking advantage of communities, the Hoopa and Karuk communities. He was paying them not in dentalium, but kind of faux dentalium. That to me really stood out, so that as much as we might want to trust everything that Gibbs has written to us, we still need to sift through some of those underlying biases that really governed how he interacted with the communities that he was describing. So there's really these really laudable kinds of things. I mean, the words that he's using in order to talk about, the importance of reserved treaty rights and reserving fisheries and hunting grounds for communities in Oregon and Washington, that exists at the same time as he's paying people in false currency. Those kinds of things are things that we have to be really aware of when we're working with these materials, with these documents, with these histories of these individuals, so we can more critically examine them instead of taking what they've written or what they've done as gospel, as kind of canonical truth. I'd love to see those porcelain dentalium beads. That, as me, as somebody who works in a historic period, I would love to see and find evidence for what those look like. I mean, just the connections you're talking about, these porcelain beads made in China and shipped all the way across the Pacific here in order to, participate in these like local exchange economies with
I suspect some of those counterfeit dentalium shells are in the collections at the Hearst Museum at Berkeley today.
Yeah, I found that very striking too. And I'm actually going to pick up on a question that I saw from one of the people, because I'm really curious about, we're talking about biases and also relationships. And I see one of the people in the chat was asking about the relationship between Native people and the missionaries. And that was kind of, was there anything that comes out of Beckham that you can, gave you a sense of, do you feel like he had sympathy for what was happening? Were there more personal details beyond, or was it very cut and dry, the sort of the documentation? And then can you say anything about the relationship between Native people and the missionaries? Did he make any observations about those relationships with settlers?
I can respond. Gibbs had very little to do with the retired missionaries in the Pacific Northwest in the 1850s. His circle of friends were the West Point military officers, particularly doctors, who were at the various military posts scattered all over the region, and they became a conduit for correspondence and filling out vocabularies. His own religious backgrounds were very interesting. His uncle was William Ellery Channing, the foremost Unitarian congregational minister in the United States in the pre-Civil War era. And William Ellery Channing had married his first cousin, Ruth Gibbs, Gibbs's aunt. So Gibbs was brought up in a somewhat agnostic household, Unitarian household, a background where he acknowledged the morality and ethics of Christianity, but never went to church. So he had very little interest in what the missionaries had to say or do. But he was fascinated with Native American religious practices. And he interviewed a number of people, both about spiritual matters as well as oral literature, and compiled a rather significant corpus of oral literary texts as dictated by his informants.
There's a couple other questions about Gibbs's relationships with other people. So One about, can you give some more details, Dr. Beckham, on Gibbs's relationship with Swan, where they met, if they maintained a relationship over the years? Was it chance encounter? Did they collaborate on sending belongings to the Smithsonian? And one more, there's a questioner who wants to know if you have any knowledge of whether Gibbs worked or collaborated with a US Coast Survey cartographer named George Davidson. So, and there's some more information there and some contact info in the Q&A if you want to follow up with that person as well. So those two folks, please.
I'll start with Davidson. Gibbs was well aware of the work of the US Coast Survey, particularly when he was doing a survey and cartographic work on Puget Sound. So he used the charts from the Wilkes expedition, and also in later years referred to George Davidson's charts when he was working on the claims for the Hudson's Bay Company Claims Commission documentation. He met Swan at Willapa Bay in probably about 1853 or 1854. They corresponded with each other. And then in the spring of 1855, they traveled together and camped together at the Chehalis River Treaty Council at Cosmopolis on the coast of Washington. Gibbs really predated Swan in ethnographic work. And by the time Gibbs had gone east in 1861, Swan was just starting to focus significantly on doing studies of the macaw and then starting collecting for the Smithsonian. So they were really a generation apart in terms of their field work. However, a book I'd well recommend is Ivan Doig's Winter Brothers, a magnificent biography of Swan based upon Swan's diaries and Doig's visits to the same locations a century later. Winter Brothers by Ivan Doig.
You have solved a mystery for me, because I knew of that book years ago and hadn't been able to find it again and had read parts of it. So thank you. I appreciate that. There's a question specifically related to Gibbs's influence on the Stevens treaties. And we've touched on that a little bit. Is there more that you want to say about that and his influence there?
Stevens was exceedingly busy when he arrived in Washington Territory. He was the new governor. He was the superintendent of Indian Affairs, and he was the commander or guiding hand in the Northern Division of the Pacific Railroad Surveys. So he held 3 concurrent federal appointments. Consequently, he needed help. And he found a Harvard-educated lawyer at Steilacoom, not far from Olympia, who knew a lot about Native peoples. So they traveled together on the Sarah Stone for a lengthy reconnaissance, nearly 5 weeks, to explore Puget Sound all the way up to Victoria. They went up the east side and then down the west side of Puget Sound. And when they returned, Stevens turned to Gibbs and said, "Draft me a treaty." And since Gibbs had already served with the Willamette Valley and Northern California Treaty Commissions, he had some understanding of the clauses that should go into a treaty agreement. Thus, in December 1854, he wrote the template treaty for the Western Washington Treaty Commission. And it turned out that it was the one that Stevens would eventually use for 10 ratified treaties in the Pacific Northwest. So there was a direct relationship of Gibbs to Stevens and those treaties. Gibbs also served as the secretary for 4 of the 5 Western Washington councils. So he had firsthand experience in being on the scene when the treaties were under negotiation. That's why his diaries and letters proved invaluable during the fishing rights controversies before Judge Bolt and Judge Bologna, Judge Walter Craig, in the fish wars of the 1960s and the 1970s. And that's why I was called on to testify. And I guess it's why the state of Oregon subpoenaed all of my doctoral dissertation notes on George Gibbs, as they were trying to find out more about him and whether or not I had preconceived notions about his relationship with the tribes.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you. There's a question that's directed at you, David, about your tribes. Does your tribe have any view on Gibbs's collection of oral texts related to religious practices and beliefs? Is that something you could speak on some?
Yeah, it's kind of a no answer, but I still think there's a good point to make, which is that in our own review of anyone who's really written about religious practices or our ancestors who've shared things, it's probably one of the most common areas where tricks are played, and that's a very common thing in ethnographies, and it's one of those values of working with tribal communities because you can get insider perspectives, and that's why we always say, if you read something about your history in a book, like don't trust it until you verify it with an elder, right? And even if the elder doesn't know all the factual information, there's just kind of an insider cultural basis of understanding those things. And so, Gibbs information, I would really treat the same, and that anytime that you get around that, and one thing that you have to recognize is that, for many tribal people then and even today, talking about those things is taboo, right? So if you have something, talking about it is a fast way to get it to leave you, right? Would be the tradition and the practice. And so there is, and I'm sure that that was only even more enticing and interesting to, an ethnographer or early amateur historian of the 1850s as it is today, right? When you tell that to somebody, they're like, oh yeah, come on, tell me more. So that's just a little bit of insight about religious practices and beliefs. But at the same time, these sources exist, and, looking at them, analyzing them, if it's important and you need to know, talking with elders and other people to get their take on it.
That's a great lead into a broader question that I'd like to ask of all of you to really talk some about Gibbs in the broader context of the history of anthropologists and ethnographers' relationships with Indigenous people. And that's, of course, a history that continues into today. So if you could think about that for us.
I want to touch on something that Shannon had said previously, because what thinking about this question brings to mind is that for most anthropologists and archaeologists, they have been really uninterested in the time at which Gibbs was working. So that 1850s period and into like the late 1800s, what most people working with tribes were interested in was documenting them before they quote unquote vanished. So most of the people working at the time kind of ascribed to this idea of this trope of the vanishing Indian. And as a result, a lot of early anthropology became documenting or salvaging cultural knowledge before these communities entirely disappeared. And yet, I think what's strikingly different of anthropology right now, and especially in the work I know that Shannon does and that I do, is that this period is actually something that we should be investigating more, because this isn't the crux at which tribes disappear, but in which they thrive, in which I think Shannon used a term a little bit earlier called survivance, which is a concept from an Indigenous studies scholar, Gerald Visner, who talks about survivance as this creative agency in order to not just survive colonial violence, but to actually thrive and flourish in the face of this. And in this 1850s period, we have a perfect example of the strategies and the creative agency that Indigenous peoples used to ensure that they would always be here, that there would be a future for their children and their grandchildren and their grandchildren's children. So I think for me, that's a really big shift that we're seeing in anthropology and archaeology now, is that this time period is being studied instead of studying it in order to get a clue to reconstruct what past lifeways were. Instead, we're looking at it for what this period represents and the future that it contains for communities today.
I can't really say it any better than what Sara just said. I think that this is sort of a time period that there is a lot of tragedy that's happening, but there's also a lot about resilience and just human resilience, and we're just trying to understand how that works and kind of get away from this what we call terminal narrative And that was something that, I mean, I wouldn't say that all anthropologists are really recognizing this, but it is definitely something that has changed quite a bit in our discipline, where anthropologists are trying to engage more with connecting threads between today and the past, and not acting like everything just ended, you know, at Euro-American contact. There is a tradition in archaeology often to separate historical archaeology from prehistoric archaeology. And, you know, it's kind of like, well, Native people lived during historic times, you know, so, and treat all the historical artifacts like they're just Euro-American. It's just the most bizarre thing. And so we're seeing people change that, even like in monographs about, you know, where we see people that were flint napping with like old broken bottles and that sort of thing. And it used to, those items used to be classified as historical glass. But now we're saying, well, yes, they're made out of historical glass, but they're part of this lithic industry that goes back thousands of years. And we sort of see this as debitage. So it's actually language that we're trying to revise our language, the way we approach these things. And I think that this time period is so critical to that, and really trying to be a little more enlightened and work with communities. I mean, that's where this, for me, I was, when I was a tribal historic preservation officer for the Elk Valley Rancheria in Northwestern California, and they taught me so much that I did not learn in university. I was really fortunate for that. They working with communities, that really helped me so much understand things a little bit better. And yeah, so I think that's critically important.
And I just want to ask you to define a couple of the archaeology words you just used, lithic, and then also you said they were part of the decollage? No, it's a different word. Can you?
Yeah, not decollage.
Sorry.
Those words. No,
I could type it in the chat. Yeah, sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah. So, yeah, lithic is just refers to sort of stone industry. So stone tools, anything that's made out of stone. And then debitage is a sort of fancy $3 word, or it's a French word for lithic flakes. so debris, and I'll type it in the chat room. Or in the chat.
Thanks a lot. That's great.
I wanted to add to that, like all of Gibbs's maps that talk about like these mining encampments, and later you get all these maps of lumber towns. We think about who was actually the employees and working in those places. It was tribal members. Like, so when we go back today as archaeologists and look at these places, oftentimes we don't contact tribes. We don't contact their tribal historic preservation officers because it's quote unquote historic, but here, historic, like who was here? It was community members, or it was people from, indigenous peoples from Hawaii that were brought out here, or others who were working at those places. So it's helping us, doing this kind of work is helping us revise what those categories look like, what is actually part of the historic record. And in this case, in Oregon and Washington, Indigenous peoples are part of this record, and they continue. There's not this gap at like 1850s when the US arrives.
Can I ask a question of Steve?
Yes, you can.
I think it's a short one. Steve, you've been at George Gibbs for years. Is there any stones that are unturned?
Are there any stones not turned?
Yeah.
Well, no, I over time, his diaries have eventually come to light. I did not have all of them at the time I was writing my dissertation. There were a lot of papers still privately held or uncatalogued. I would add that Gibbs is interesting because of the breadth of his interests. There was one linguist who preceded him, Horatio Hale, came to the Pacific Northwest in 1841 and was here for a few months with the Wilkes expedition. But Hale's interest was almost exclusively language. He produced a volume on philology. Gibbs had an interest in language, but also in material culture, in place names, in lifeways, in literature. And he did so without a theoretical basis that I've ever ascertained. Unlike his contemporary Lewis Henry Morgan, who was shaped by kinship terms and kinship terminology, Gibbs was not carrying that type of baggage. Instead, he was out there just drinking it all in, writing it down as fast as he could. He had a great passion for discovery of the people around him. And it was his choice to stay and live and camp out for much of the time for 11 years in really rugged conditions in Oregon, Washington, and California. And he seemed to enjoy that.
Thank you very much. We're going to run just slightly over because there's one question that someone has wanting to know specifically whether Gibbs worked with women in his work. And if you could address that, Dr. Beckham, we'd appreciate it.
Gibbs, as you know, sketched women. He studied their basketry and art forms. I do not know that any of his informants that were identified were women. He was mostly living in a world of men, and he does identify by name a number of his informants, both for languages and for culture. So that's about as far as I can go in responding.
Thanks. I wanted to make sure we got that in. This has been fascinating for me, and I really appreciate this conversation because it also influences some of the way that that I can think about the work that we do at the Oregon Historical Society. So I'm really grateful to all of you for taking the time. David, if you would just wrap us up and let us know about sort of where the program will be from here and anything else about the summit you want us to know.
Great. So thank you all for attending. We have the video presentation, and we'll also be putting up a recording and any book references or things like that that have been messaged. And that'll go up on the Grand Round website at that link that I shared earlier, which is www.grandrond.org/HC Summit. And so if you know somebody who you think would like to watch this and they weren't able to tune in, you can send them to the website. And within about a week, we'll have it up, and it'll stay up for around 3 months. Also, one thing that we're doing, just like OHS has a research library, we're working on our own research library out at the tribe. And these stories and other, making efforts to make these materials accessible that relate to Gibbs. And so, we're committed to working with Steve and others to make sure that people can find and access materials over time that relate to this and then other connections to tribal people as well. Please consider coming to History and Culture Summit in the future and the other great events that Oregon Historical Society has on their calendar. So thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. And thanks so much, panelists and presenters. We appreciate you so much. And everybody stay safe, take care of yourselves and each other, and we'll see you again next time.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.